I am so glad to spend this moment with you and to spend it in God's Word. We're going to be in Hebrews this morning, chapter 13, if you'd like to get out a Bible and be turning there. And we are, as I mentioned last week, getting near to the end of this powerful book of the Bible and finding at the end of it so many practical applications for how not only can we be on this journey following Christ to the land He's promised us, but we can actually grow stronger with every mile if we can put these words to practice in our lives. And I hope that you and I both can be encouraged and challenged by what Hebrews 13 has to say to us this morning. This morning, I had it on my mind to begin by sharing with you a few things that I'm thankful for. Three things, actually, that I'm thankful for. The first of which is this church family who have been showing me your commitment to Christ, your commitment to one another in so many touching ways, even these past few months when we don't see each other as much as I would like for us to. Still, I see it so many ways in you, from the way that our church has just adopted our seniors and really spoiled them and showered them with so many wonderful gifts and things like that, to the way that the church has supported my family with cards and prayers and comfort as we've had kind of a rocky month as a family these past few weeks with some losses and difficult things going on. I wanted to say that I'm thankful for that. You make me want to be a better person, a better minister through your commitment, through your sympathy, through your compassion and selflessness and maturity, and you really lift one another up, and I'm thankful for that. So that's the first thing. The second thing I'm thankful for this week specifically is compassionate hearts. And I've been thinking about this week that we are actually surrounded by a lot of people where we live today who have compassionate hearts. And what a good thing that is. I was reminded of this on Wednesday in particular. Many of you may not know this, but on Wednesday, College Hill was blessed to play a small part in an event that Wish with Wings put on. Wish with Wings is it's kind of like the Make-A-Wish Foundation. And as you know, and as Mark mentioned in our prayer earlier, there's a young girl, Eliana, Holiday Heights student, who's really in a tough place with her health right now. And Wish with Wings partnered with our community to put on this joy parade to drive by their house and lift them up. And they asked us if we could play a part by offering our parking lot as a starting point and organizing point. And I was here on Wednesday and I watched as literally hundreds of people were here to show their compassion to that family. And it was really touching. We had, policemen on motorcycles and horses, big red fire trucks. There were Disney princesses. Cinderella was here. Santa Claus was here. There was a carriage, kind of like Cinderella's carriage before it turns into a pumpkin. There were family and friends. There were Holiday Heights teachers and faculty, and all of them were here just to show the compassion of their hearts to this family that needs a boost. And I was just so thankful in that moment that God has given us that ability to show compassion in our hearts. And when I see it all around us, it makes me excited about what God can do in this place. It makes me excited about what God is doing right here in our neighborhood. And I'm thankful for that. And so these things that I have been thankful for have sort of just been kind of swirling around in my mind as I contemplate the third thing, the third thing that I'm thankful for. And this is the one that comes from our passage from Hebrews this morning. The third thing that I'm thankful for this week is worship. Worship is the subject of our verses from Hebrews chapter 13. And worship has been on my mind a lot this week as well, as you might imagine. Worship is something that I'm thankful for today, but not just any kind of worship. I am thankful specifically right now today for worship when it is difficult to worship. Because difficult worship, I think, has this power all its own. And when worship is challenged and yet chosen still, it burns all the brighter in us and becomes in us a sacrifice of praise. In fact, that familiar phrase, a sacrifice of praise, we may know it from some of the songs that we sing. It comes directly from our passage from Hebrews this morning. And this is what the passage says. Hebrews chapter 13, beginning in verse 14, it says, "For here we have no lasting city, but we are looking for the city that is to come. Through him, then, let us continually offer a sacrifice of praise to God. That is, the fruit of lips that confess his name, and do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God." And it's my plan to spend our final 2 weeks in Hebrews talking about these 3 important verses, and specifically today, what it means to offer a sacrifice of praise to God. What does that look like? What does that really mean? When I was planning this series back in December, I had an idea for what I thought that might mean. Or at least I had a plan for how I was going to preach on it. Originally, I had planned for this passage to be next week. It was going to fall on Fifth Sunday, our big Fifth Sunday fellowship day, and I was going to preach a short sermon, and the people would rejoice. And also, we were going to fill that extra time and just surround it with singing and blend our voices and lift our voices together in praise to God. And that's how we were going to end our time in Hebrews. We were just going to end it with this crescendo, this lifting up of our voices together in this room in praise to God, and we would just offer our sacrifice of praise. That was the plan in December. But of course, you know that plans like that haven't really worked out like we thought they would, have they? Here we are at this passage, the crescendo, and we're still a tiny little gathering of socially distanced worshipers here at the building this morning, and most of you are worshiping today at home, participating and contributing, and it's good and it's nourishing and it's joyful, but at the same time, I know it's also difficult. It's not what we expected. It's difficult, and in a way that we could never have imagined to worship and offer our worship these days. I think I've been thinking about Psalm 137 a little differently these days. That is a psalm about worship. It's written in the time when Israel was in exile. It says, "By the rivers of Babylon we sat and we wept." Our captors, the ones that led us into exile, asked us to sing our songs. But how can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? They're wrestling with, how can we worship God here and now? How can we worship in exile at this time in our lives when home and life as we knew it feels so far away? I think I can read that psalm a little bit differently nowadays. I can relate a little bit more with the sitting and the waiting and the asking. How do we worship now? How can we sing here, in this place, in these times? And the answer, in a lot of ways, I think, is it's difficult. It's really, really difficult. In a way that we didn't want or ask for or wish that it would be. But what if it's not all bad? What if worship sometimes is meant to be difficult? And what if difficult worship might even burn brighter? With those questions in mind, I came back to Hebrews 13. And one really important word in that passage started to jump off the page for me. We are called in these verses to continually offer what? A sacrifice of praise. And maybe we're just so familiar with that phrase that we might just brush right over it, but we are called to offer a sacrifice of praise. And what does that mean? What is that comparing our worship to? What we have here is Old Testament language transformed, right? So one of the big parts of worship throughout the Old Testament, one of the main ways that God's people worshiped God was through the offering of sacrifices. And that took many forms, of course. There were some sacrifices that had to do with atonement and some that had to do with guilt. There were some that were for other reasons of worship. There were some that were called free will offerings. There were others that were called thanksgiving offerings. Sacrifices in the Old Testament came in many forms, but the thing to notice about them, all of them, in all of their forms, is that they were all an act of worship. And not only that, but a sacrifice, by very definition, is something that is difficult to offer. That's what makes it a sacrifice, right? So one of the key acts of worship that God's people gave to God all throughout the Bible was a difficult one. And why might that be? When God instructed his people to worship him through difficult sacrifices, was he just trying to make it hard on them? Was he just doing it, making it tough for sport? Of course not. This difficult act was purposeful. It was transformative. It was a demonstration. It shaped the heart. It shined a light. This difficult act of worship was a demonstration that we trust you, Lord. We are devoted to you, Lord. And it was that precisely because it was hard. So the point I'm trying to get to is that a sacrifice is something that is offered that is difficult to offer. And a sacrifice is something that is offered selflessly. And those great many offerings throughout the Old Testament were a huge part of the worship of God. Well, then Hebrews comes along, and as we've seen in this letter, it has something new and powerful to say about sacrifices, right? We don't need the blood of bulls and goats to cleanse us from sin as if they ever could, because God has given us Jesus, who is our perfect sacrifice, and it's his blood that cleanses us, not those sacrifices of old. That's like one of the huge points of Hebrews, especially in chapters 6 through 10. It's changing the way we think about sacrifice through what Jesus has done. But before we go and leave sacrifice in the dust and say, well, it really doesn't apply to us anymore, here comes Hebrews 13, and it says, no, you do have a sacrifice to offer. But what is that sacrifice? It's the sacrifice of praise. It's not the fruit of your crops. It's not like the first fruits of wheat or grain. It's the fruit of your lips, verse 15, when we confess Jesus as Lord. Hebrews says your praise, your worship can be compared to the sacrifices of the Old Testament. And what does that mean? Remember what we said earlier. A sacrifice is something offered that is difficult to offer. And a sacrifice is offered selflessly. So should our worship be. Our worship should be offered even when it's difficult to offer. And our worship should be offered selflessly. That's what makes it a sacrifice of praise. And there is a place for difficult worship in our lives. Personally, I think this is something that we have always known and recognized, that worship ought to be a selfless act. A lot of times this gets brought up when we talk together about different songs and different people's preferences when it comes to songs. There are old songs, there are new songs, there are peppy songs, there are blue songs, there are songs that use old words like fetter, and we have to get our dictionary and look up what's a fetter. And then there are other new songs that maybe repeat the same line like 8 times in a row, and some people are like, well, can we just get on with it? We know that, there's just different preferences when it comes to songs, but in a congregation of believers, we have to be patient with one another, bear with one another, practice some selflessness in our worship, and sometimes that's difficult. But these days, I think it's clear we face something a little bigger than that, don't we? These days, the degree of difficulty when it comes to our worship is amplified, and the reality is it's not going to get easier overnight. So why don't we think of it this way? Every single one of us has been given the opportunity to offer a sacrifice of praise. Every single one of us has something we can do in this difficult season to offer difficult worship selflessly to our God. And I would like to maybe help us think about some concrete examples for how that might apply to us wherever we may be right now when it comes to our worship. Whether it's a plan that you have in your household to be a part of in-person worship sooner rather than later or not. Whatever it is. The question we can be asking is, how can you in your situation offer a sacrifice of praise? How can you worship when it's difficult and do it selflessly? Maybe let's start with an obvious one. If you're one of those people who's determined that you're ready to be present in person on a Sunday morning, but you start feeling kind of sick on Friday night, what do you think would be the selfless way to worship? You can ask yourself that question. Because it's not a noble act to gut it up and come anyway. Absolutely not. Because you have a chance to offer a sacrifice of praise by staying home, even though it might be disappointing to have to do that, and letting us know how you're feeling so we can pray for you and we can help you any way that we can. Now, I know that that's such an obvious example. You probably think, well, I don't need to hear that. I know that we are so mature that we would never treat our Christian siblings recklessly when it comes to things like that. Let me share another one with you. When we start having assemblies together again, there are going to be some guidelines, as Steve alluded to this morning. It's not going to be exactly just how it was before we left. There are going to be some expectations of us. Well, suppose someone comes along and you think, well, these plans and procedures, they're just kind of overkill, aren't they? It's really just all overblown, and I'm going to do what I want to do. Maybe you feel that way. Maybe someone's going to lean over to the person next to them and say, what's all this fuss about? Or maybe you're thinking in your heart, like, well, I just love my brother so much, I can't help but give him a hug in the back of the church. And look, I think it's hard not to do that. So maybe you say, why shouldn't I? I'd like for us to ask a different question. I want us to consider, how can I offer a sacrifice of praise? Maybe it's difficult to abide by the rules. Maybe it's going to take some selflessness to do things we don't want to do. But what about our brother, who maybe is nervous but here, and the reason they're here is because they're hoping people are going to abide by the rules? What about the sister who's not yet ready and at home? And one of the things she's watching is, what is the church going to do? How are we going to handle ourselves? And they may be looking to see how much you care for them by the way you treat your brother and sister, so that down the line, when they're ready, they can be here. You see, doing your own thing and saying, well, what's all the fuss about? That's one way to go about it. But it might actually push our brothers and sisters who we want to be here away for longer, when instead we could offer a sacrifice of praise. That's difficult worship, selflessly given. And I think that this applies not just to those who are going to be here sooner rather than later. I think it applies to all of us. So what if you're one of those people who's saying, well, it's going to be a little while before I'm a part of an in-person worship service. Can I also offer a sacrifice of praise? I think absolutely you can. And what I don't mean by that is to go when you're not yet ready to go. That's not what I mean by difficult worship selflessly given. To me, there's something else you can do. What I think is going to be really difficult with worship is remaining plugged in week after week when it takes time before you're ready to come back here again. There's some wonderful things about our live stream, and I hope it brings joy to you and goodness to your life every single week. But we also know that there's parts of it that are tough. And we can't totally replicate what it's like to be together here. And that can be hard. So think about how important it is for you to view your worship sacrificially. It's more important now than ever, because it's going to take some discipline to keep plugging in and keep being involved as one week turns to the next. But what if you can view every time you engage as a sacrifice of praise? It's difficult worship, but you're doing it selflessly because it's about more than just yourself, and that's pleasing to God. And then, of course, for all of us, no matter where you are on that spectrum, and everybody has reasons to be where we are on that spectrum, it's going to take some selflessness. It's going to take some sacrifice to bear with your brothers and sisters who might be in a different place than where you are. We're dealing with something unprecedented here. Many of the forces in our world, they want to demonize and put down and ridicule anyone who thinks differently. But we're called to something bigger than that, right? We're God's church. We confess Jesus as Lord. It's the fruit of our lips. And we confess it together. And so we're meant to bear with one another. And if we can do that, our sacrifice of praise is going to shine brightly. It's going to burn brightly in our world, because that's what God has shown us that He can do. And this is the last thing I want to say this morning. It's that God has shown us time and time again that He can take our difficult worship, selflessly given, and make it burn bright. Make it transform us. Make it shine to the people that see us in the world. Like, we have so many examples of this in Scripture, it's not even funny. Like, I think about Paul and Silas in Acts chapter 16. Remember what happened to them? They were beaten in the town square. They were locked up in a jail cell. What did they do that night? Verse 25, at midnight, Paul and Silas were still praying and singing hymns to God in a jail cell, solitary confinement or whatever, and the prisoners were listening to them. Paul and Silas, confined in body, were worshiping like those who are free in spirit. They worshiped when it was difficult. It might have seemed like they were alone, but their voices were heard. God made their sacrifice of praise burn brightly in the dungeons of despair. What about King David? We spent Wednesday nights Last fall, looking at the story of King David, do you remember how many times he offered difficult worship to God? Whether it was when he was on the run in the wilderness with King Saul, or even later on in his life when he was dealing with the darkest days, when he loses his child born of Bathsheba. When we look at his story, what we find is that again and again, he comes back to worship the Lord, even when it's hard on him, and that worship shapes him. We see David grow. With each sacrifice of praise, David becomes a better David, more trusting, more resilient, more like God's own heart. God makes that sacrifice burn bright, and it refines his heart like a fire within. What about our psalm from earlier? By the rivers of Babylon we sat, we wept. How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? Do you remember what happens next? If I forget you, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you above my highest joy. Here we have God's people in exile, and they're saying it's going to be difficult to sing God's songs here and now. But may we never forget to sing God's songs here and now. May we rise to the challenge, they say. May we set you always above our highest joy. And it's because of examples like those and so many more that I can say this morning, I'm thankful for difficult worship. And I want us to be ready. Ready with our selfless hearts and choices. Let's give God a chance to burn brightly in our sacrifice of praise. To me, this is a challenge for all of us, wherever you are today. And maybe you're challenged today to resolve in your heart that you're going to make the choice to be selfless in your acts of worship, whatever they may be, these next few weeks. Because you know what God can do with that. You know what difference it can make. Maybe for someone you've been walking in sin apart from Jesus, and what you need to do is surrender your life, a living sacrifice, to God. Like when we're immersed in baptism, we're giving up that old life, laying it down like a sacrifice, being raised up to walk anew, raised up to live our lives in praise to God. However we may be called or challenged, let's praise God with selfless hearts as we sing this song of encouragement.